So, let's go. Artemis II came home safely. Perfect splashdown, 4 crew members waving at cameras, champagne in mission control. The headlines called it a triumph, a record, the farthest any human being had traveled from Earth in over 50 years. And somewhere in the back of the room, a group of engineers stared at their screens and quietly wondered if they'd gotten lucky. Here are 9 things about the Artemis mission that nobody can fully explain yet. Number 1. The known defect. Before Artemis II launched, NASA already knew something was wrong with the heat shield. In December 2022, Artemis I came back from an uncrewed test flight. The engineers pulled the capsule out of the Pacific and just stared at it. Over 100 locations on the heat shield where the material had worn away differently than the models predicted. Not a little differently. Completely differently. 3 of the 4 separation bolts embedded in the shield had melted through their own thermal barriers. The computer models said none of this would happen. The computer models were wrong. The material on the outside of the capsule is called avcoat. It's an ablative heat shield, which means it's designed to burn away slowly, absorbing heat so the capsule doesn't. Think of it like a controlled sacrifice. The shield burns so the crew doesn't have to. The problem is that when avcoat burns, it produces gas. That gas needs somewhere to go. If the outer layer seals too quickly, pressure builds up underneath it, and chunks start blowing off. On Artemis I, that's exactly what happened. Not catastrophically, but enough that every engineer in the room recognized the pattern immediately. NASA had time before Artemis II launched to address this. What they chose to do was change the re-entry trajectory, fly a slightly different path through the atmosphere that would keep the heat shield in a thermal range where the gas pressure problem would be less severe. The shield itself, the actual physical material with the actual documented flaw, flew anyway, unchanged. Charles Camarda, a former NASA astronaut who spent years working the Columbia disaster investigation, opposed the decision publicly and by name. He didn't predict the crew would die. What he said was more unsettling than that. He said the reasoning process was broken, that flying a known defect and succeeding teaches institutions the wrong lesson. That confidence built on incomplete understanding is more dangerous than acknowledged uncertainty because you stop looking for what you missed. The cabin interior stayed in the mid-70s Fahrenheit throughout re-entry. The margin held, but it was smaller than it was designed to be, and the engineers knew that going in. The crew came home. The question of whether NASA fully understood the risk they were accepting or whether they made a schedule-driven bet that happened to pay off remains genuinely open. And the answer to that question matters more than the outcome, because Artemis III is already being planned. Number 2, the flaw that was already solved 50 years ago. Here's what makes the heat shield story stranger. This wasn't a new problem. It was a forgotten solution. In the 1960s, Apollo's heat shield used a honeycomb structure. Hundreds of thousands of tiny hexagonal cells, each one individually filled with avcoat by hand. It was painstaking, slow, enormously labor-intensive work, but the honeycomb shape did something elegant without anyone having to design it in. The boundaries between all those tiny cells created natural pathways for gas to escape during ablation. The shield breathed. Pressure couldn't build up because there were too many tiny exits for it to use. Nobody engineered the permeability as a separate feature. It was an emergent property of the geometry. When NASA developed Orion for the Artemis program, the avcoat formula was licensed to a new manufacturer and the design changed. Instead of a honeycomb of hundreds of thousands of individual cells, the new shield used around 200 large prefabricated blocks, think big prefab wall panels, instead of a hand-laid mosaic. Simpler to manufacture, fewer seams, faster to produce, and significantly less permeable, because there were far fewer internal boundaries for gas to escape through. Then, and this is the part that genuinely stays with you, they made the blocks denser, not to fix the permeability, not to improve the thermal performance, to make ultrasonic quality inspection easier. Denser material scans better with sound waves. You can detect internal defects more reliably. The quality assurance engineer got exactly what they needed to do their job well. The thermal engineer had no idea what had just been traded away. These were 2 different goals, owned by 2 different teams, and nobody was explicitly responsible for the conflict between them. The Apollo engineers, who understood why the original design needed to breathe, who had internalized the permeability lesson through years of testing and iteration, had retired. The contracts had ended. The companies had changed. The institutional memory walked out the door with the people who held it, and nobody wrote it down in a way that survived the transition. Somewhere in the 50 years between Apollo 17 and Artemis I, knowledge that had kept astronauts alive during re-entry quietly evaporated. And nobody noticed it was gone until the capsule came back looking like it had been through something. It barely survived. One generation solved the problem through hard experience. The next generation never knew there had been a problem to solve. So they built the same flaw from scratch, with better manufacturing equipment and worse institutional memory. And the cruelest irony is that the modification they made specifically to improve quality control, making the blocks denser to catch defects more reliably, was itself the thing that made the shield more likely to fail. They optimized for safety, and made it less safe. And nobody noticed because the people who would have noticed were gone. Number 3. The 6-minute blackout. April 10th, 2026. 8:07 in the evening, Eastern Time. That's when Orion hit the water off the coast of San Diego. Mission Control called it a perfect bullseye. Before that moment, there were 6 minutes where nobody on Earth could reach the crew. Not because of a malfunction, not because of a systems failure, because physics wouldn't allow it. When Orion hits the upper atmosphere at nearly 25,000 miles per hour, the air in front of it can't get out of the way fast enough. It compresses so violently, so instantaneously, that it stops being air. It ionizes. It becomes plasma, a sheath of superheated charged particles that wraps around the entire capsule like a cocoon made of fire. And plasma blocks radio waves, every frequency, all of them simultaneously. There is no channel you can switch to. There is no backup system that penetrates it. The capsule is a sealed room falling through the atmosphere at hypersonic speed, and for 6 minutes, it is completely unreachable. The heat shield surface reaches 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit during this phase. The air immediately in front of it exceeds 18,000 degrees. To put that in some kind of human frame, the surface of the sun runs at around 10,000 degrees. The air in front of Orion during re-entry is nearly twice that. And the shield between the crew and that temperature is the one that came back from Artemis I, covered in unexpected pockmarks. The crew isn't flying the capsule during any of this. Re-entry is fully automated. They are passengers. Strapped into seats, pulling nearly 4 Gs of deceleration. That's the sensation of a grand piano sitting on your chest while someone lights the room on fire with nothing to do but wait and trust that the engineering holds. Every decision that matters has already been made by people on the ground. The crew's job at this point is to survive the outcome of those decisions. Jeff Radigan, the lead flight director for Artemis II, said afterward that he felt what he called an irrational fear that is simply human nature, which is an interesting thing to admit. A flight director at NASA, surrounded by the most sophisticated monitoring systems ever built for a crewed mission, describing his 6 minutes as irrational fear. He knew the numbers. He'd signed off on them. And he was still afraid. In the family viewing room at Mission Control, the spouses and children and parents of the 4 crew members sat and watched a screen that showed nothing useful. The last confirmed telemetry, a clock. The trajectory prediction. You can have all the data in the world and still spend 6 minutes in a room that feels like a waiting room outside surgery. There is no update. There is no partial information. There is only the clock. Then the signal came back. Then the parachutes deployed all 11 of them in the correct sequence for the first time ever on a crewed lunar return. Then the splash. Then 4 voices on the radio saying they were doing well. 6 minutes. Families in a room watching a clock. A grand piano on your chest while the air outside hits 18,000 degrees. That's what the triumphant splashdown footage doesn't show you. Number 4. What the re-entry left behind. Here's what we still don't actually know. Whether the fix worked. The heat shield from Artemis II is currently being disassembled at NASA's Ames Research Center. Engineers are cataloging every divot, every region of unexpected wear, every surface anomaly. They're mapping the damage pattern across the entire shield and comparing it against what Artemis I came back with. That comparison will answer the critical question, did the modified trajectory actually solve the permeability problem, or did Artemis II simply have enough margin left to survive the same underlying flaw at a slightly lower intensity? The uncomfortable detail is that the models used to certify the Artemis II fix were the same models that failed to predict the Artemis I damage in the first place. NASA worked backward from the Artemis I flight data, reverse-engineered the cracking in a lab environment, and validated a fix using small Avcoat coupons tested in an ArcJet facility. The coupons behaved correctly. But a coupon is not a full-scale heat shield. It doesn't experience the same pressure gradients, the same thermal gradients across its surface, the same interaction between adjacent blocks under load. The full-scale shield is a more complex system than any of its tested components, and no validated model exists that correctly predicts its behavior under actual re-entry conditions. The Artemis I damage proved that. The question is whether the Artemis II data will prove the models have improved or just gotten luckier. Artemis III is planned to return from a deeper lunar landing mission. Deeper orbit means higher re-entry velocity. Higher re-entry velocity means more heat, more pressure, more gas production, more demand on a shield that we still don't fully understand at scale. Whatever margin of uncertainty is built into the current thermal models doesn't get smaller as the missions get more ambitious. It compounds with every new variable. The mission is over. The question it was designed to answer, is the heat shield problem actually solved, won't be answered until the engineers finish tearing the capsule apart. And even then the answer might be, we got closer, but we're not there yet. Which means Artemis III is being planned in the shadow of an open question. Number 5, the radiation gauntlet. Right now, sitting wherever you are, a cosmic ray just passed through your body. You didn't feel it. Another one will pass through in a few seconds. This happens continuously, all day, every day, for your entire life. You are being threaded by high-energy particles from across the galaxy on a constant schedule, and you will never perceive a single one of them. The reason this doesn't hurt you is that you're inside Earth's magnetic field. The field isn't perfect. It leaks and flexes and has gaps, especially near the poles, but it deflects the vast majority of the most dangerous particles before they reach you. You've been living inside a planetary shield your entire life without thinking about it once. The Artemis II crew left that shield behind entirely. Completely. They flew through the Van Allen belts and out the other side into unprotected deep space, and they stayed there for the better part of 10 days. Beyond the magnetosphere, the radiation environment is a fundamentally different place. Galactic cosmic rays arrive from every direction simultaneously, accelerated by supernovae tens of thousands of light years away. Solar particle events can send surges of high-energy protons with very little warning, and the particles that matter most for biological tissue are the heavy ions' large atomic nuclei, iron and silicon and oxygen and others, traveling at significant fractions of the speed of light. When a heavy ion passes through a cell, it doesn't scatter off it the way a lighter particle might. It drives a trail of damage straight through the cellular structure. Broken DNA strands, disrupted membranes, compromised cellular machinery. In animal studies, measurable deficits in learning, memory, and mood regulation have followed from single heavy ion exposures to brain tissue. The crew of Artemis II spent 10 days absorbing that environment. The background rate of cosmic ray exposure beyond the magnetosphere is hundreds of times higher than at sea level. Hundreds of times! They were inside a tin can the size of a large SUV, hearing the constant hum of fans and pumps, unable to see or feel or hear any of the particles threading through them on a relentless, invisible schedule. There is no alarm, there is no sensation, there is nothing. It just happens, the whole time, every second. Now here is where the science is honest about what it knows and what it doesn't. The exposure happened. That's documented. Some cellular damage occurred. That's certain. Some of that damage will repair itself through normal cellular mechanisms. That's also established. But what the accumulation of heavy ions strikes through brain tissue produces in a human being over the following months and years, that is a genuinely open question. Some effects may be permanent. Some may not emerge for a decade. The crew is being monitored carefully, and the data being collected from Artemis II will be some of the most important radiation biology data ever gathered from a human mission. But the answers aren't in yet. Anyone who tells you confidently what the long-term effects will be is telling you something the science doesn't currently support. Number 6. The brains that went to the moon. Your brain has never had to think about gravity. It just assumes it. The entire drainage system inside your skull, the flow of cerebrospinal fluid, the regulation of intracranial pressure, the direction blood pools and moves, is built around one fixed assumption, 1G, pointing down, forever. Your brain has been making this assumption since before you were born. It is the single most reliable fact in your body's entire operational history. Take it away, and things start moving. Within hours of entering microgravity, cerebrospinal fluid begins shifting upward. The brain itself drifts slightly toward the top of the skull. The pressure inside your head, normally a stable 5 to 15 millimeters of mercury, begins to rise, not sharply, not dangerously, not acutely, just a slow, chronic, subtle elevation that your body can't equalize because the postural adjustments it normally uses to manage pressure don't work in zero gravity. On Earth, you stand up and your body redistributes fluid downward. In orbit, there is no down. The pressure has nowhere to go. Studies of astronauts who spent 6 months on the International Space Station found that their brain ventricles, the fluid-filled chambers deep inside the brain, had expanded by more than 3/4 of a milliliter. That sounds small. It isn't. Those chambers are supposed to be stable. The expansion took around 3 years to reverse after the astronauts returned to Earth. Some changes didn't fully reverse at all. Around 70% of astronauts who spend significant time in microgravity develop spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. The back of the eyeball flattens. The optic nerve swells. The retina develops small folds. These are structural changes to the physical tissue of the eye, driven by elevated pressure transmitted from the skull. Some of those changes are still measurable 7 years after landing. 7 years from a 6-month mission. The Artemis II crew was only gone for 10 days, so the magnitude of these effects is smaller than a long-duration ISS mission. But they traveled 252,756 miles from Earth. No human being had gone that far since December 1972, and in 1972, MRI technology didn't exist. We have never scanned a human brain before and after it traveled beyond the moon's far side. We have no baseline. We have no comparison group. We have no prior data point of any kind. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen are the first people in history whose brains can be imaged before and after that specific journey. The post-flight scans are being taken right now. And whatever those images show, neuroscience has no existing category to put them in. We don't know what we're going to find. We don't know what it will mean. We don't know how long it will take to resolve, or whether it fully will. Commander Wiseman walked off the recovery ship under his own power. His vestibular system, the inner ear network that tells your body which way is up, had spent 10 days being completely recalibrated for an environment with no up, and was now being asked to recalibrate back in real time while cameras rolled. His brain was, in that moment, actively arguing with itself about the direction of gravity. The data from those post-flight scans will shape how we think about human deep space travel for the next generation of missions, and we don't have it yet. Number 7. The sound behind the moon. This one is older than Artemis, much older. During the Apollo missions, whenever the command module swung around to the lunar far side, all communication with Earth stopped. The moon's bulk sits between you and every radio antenna on the planet. No signal in, no signal out for the entire duration of the far side pass. Each pass lasted roughly an hour. You are on the back of the moon, alone, in a silence so complete that mission controllers on Earth couldn't even tell if you were still alive. On Apollo 15, something happened during that silence. Something bled through the crew's headsets. Not static, not the familiar crackle of a communications link. Something with rhythm and texture. Whooshing sounds, electronic tones. The crew described it as outer space type music, which is both a reasonable description and an absolutely unnerving one when you're an astronaut orbiting another world alone in the dark. Apollo 16 reported it. Apollo 17 reported it. The transcripts of these communications were withheld from the public after the missions. They were only declassified after a press inquiry forced them out. NASA's official explanation, when it came, was radio interference, specifically crosstalk between the VHF radio systems in the command module and the lunar module, two transmitters operating in close proximity and coupling in unexpected ways. That explanation is technically plausible. Radio systems do produce interference artifacts. The phenomenon is real. What doesn't quite resolve is the variability. 3 separate crews, multiple separate farside passes each, and the descriptions of what they heard varied. The intensity varied. If this were a stable technical artifact produced by 2 fixed radio systems interacting in a consistent electromagnetic environment, you would expect the sound to be consistent. Same pitch, same pattern. Same intensity every single time because the hardware isn't changing between orbits. But that's not what the crews described. Artemis II passed the lunar far side. Different altitude, different inclination, modern avionics with diagnostic capabilities the Apollo crews never had. No anomalous sounds have been reported from the mission, which could mean the Apollo phenomenon was exactly what NASA said. Mundane interference that modern shielded electronics eliminate entirely. or it could mean whatever produced it 50 years ago isn't present under current mission parameters. Either way, Artemis II may have quietly closed a question that's been open since 1971, and the only way to know is to go looking through the far side data that nobody has publicly announced they're examining. Number 8. The far side up close. The last time a human being looked at the lunar far side from close orbit, the Vietnam War was still ongoing. For 50 years, everything we knew about the far side came from satellites, radar mapping, gravity surveys, and a handful of robotic landers. No human eyes, no direct observation at close range. The scientific consensus solidified into something that felt complete. The moon is a geologically dead body. The broad strokes are understood. The far side is weirder than the near side, but we have models for why, and those models are essentially settled. The near side has dark volcanic plains called maria. The far side has almost none, more craters, different composition distribution, unusual, but explained. The Artemis II crew orbited at a different altitude and inclination than Apollo ever did. Modern imaging sensors, with far better dynamic range than anything available in the 1970s. New approach angles on features that had only ever been mapped from directly overhead at lower resolution. Some of what the crew photographed had never been observed at close range from that perspective before. Beneath them on several passes was the South Pole Aitken Basin. It is the largest confirmed impact crater in the solar system, nearly 1,500 miles across, around 5 miles deep at its lowest point. To put that in scale, it is roughly the distance from New York to Denver, turned into a hole in the moon. And the South Pole Aitken Basin has a problem, which is that its composition doesn't match what the impact models predict. When something that large hits a planetary body, it should excavate material from deep in the interior and scatter it across the surrounding surface in a predictable pattern. The material that should be there, based on what we understand about the lunar interior and the physics of giant impacts, isn't distributed the way the models expect. The depth profile doesn't fit cleanly. Something about the way that basin formed, or what was underneath the surface when it did, doesn't match the story. The full imagery and sensor dataset from Artemis II is still under analysis. Papers are working through peer review. The complete scientific picture from the mission hasn't been published yet. What the crew saw, what the instruments recorded, what the high-resolution photographs of features no human had observed at close range since 1972 actually show most of that is still sitting in embargoed files and early-stage analysis pipelines. The moon isn't a finished story. It never was. We just stopped looking closely enough to notice the parts that didn't fit. Number 9. The Mars problem. Everything the Artemis II crew experienced, the radiation threading through their tissue, the fluid shifting inside their skulls, the bone density loss beginning in their legs, the vestibular system rebooting on splashdown, the brains that arrived home subtly different from the brains that left, all of it happened over 10 days. A round trip to Mars, with current propulsion technology, takes somewhere between 2 and 3 years. Most of that duration is spent in deep space, outside Earth's magnetic field, in a pressurized habitat probably not dramatically larger than what Orion provided. The radiation exposure doesn't pause for the journey. The intracranial pressure dynamics don't pause. The muscle atrophy doesn't pause. Every physiological effect that manifested in 10 days of deep space exposure scales with duration in ways we cannot fully characterize yet, because nobody has done the experiment. We have 6-month ISS missions as data, which are long but conducted inside partial magnetic protection relatively close to Earth. We have Artemis II, which was short but genuinely deep. We do not have the combination of both. We have no data point for what 2 years in deep space does to a human body and brain, because no human being has ever experienced it. If a crew member develops significant neurological symptoms 8 months into the outbound journey to Mars, the radio delay between the spacecraft and Earth is around 20 minutes each way. A question takes 40 minutes to get an answer. A medical emergency plays out in real time, with no possibility of meaningful real-time support from specialists on the ground. And the crew cannot turn around. The orbital mechanics of a Mars mission don't offer an early return option partway through. You committed to the trajectory when you left. Whatever is happening inside that spacecraft, the crew resolves it from inside the spacecraft with the medical resources they brought on a timeline that doesn't flex. We are planning Mars missions. That planning is happening now in real institutions with real budgets and real timelines. And we are doing it without the full data set we need to understand what we're sending people into. Artemis II was a critical first step toward closing that gap. The post-flight physiology results, the brain imaging data, the radiation dosimetry, the long-term monitoring of 4 crew members over the months and years ahead, all of it feeds into the calculation. All of it informs whether and how and with what protections we can put humans on a 2-year deep space trajectory and expect them to arrive functional. They came home safely. That is real, and it matters enormously. But a safe return is not the same thing as a understood one. Somewhere between those two things, between the champagne and the applause, and the families finally exhaling, and the quiet ongoing work in imaging suites and engineering bays and data analysis pipelines, that's where the actual answers are being built right now, on a timeline that doesn't fit into any news cycle. The mission is over. The questions it raised are just getting started, and the next crew is already training.